The silence of an archive is not merely the absence of sound, it is the weight of stories that have nowhere to go. In the climate-controlled basements of the State Psychiatric Repository, there are thousands of boxes, each containing the paper remains of a life once deemed unfit for the outside world. Most of these files are mundane, exhausting lists of symptoms, dietary requirements, and the repetitive notes of overworked nurses. But in the winter of 2012, a team of researchers specializing in early 20th century institutional history stumbled upon a collection that defied the standard bureaucratic meticulousness of the era. Stored in a series of water-damaged crates originally from the Blackwood Heights Sanatorium were the records of precisely 10,000 patients admitted between February and November of 1915. The folders were pristine, the cardstock heavy and expensive. The names were neatly typed. The admission dates were stamped in violet ink. But when the researchers opened the files to examine the clinical histories, they found something chilling in its uniformity. Under the headings for presenting condition, diagnosis, and course of treatment, the pages were entirely blank, not a single stroke of a pen, no shorthand, no scribbled observations. 10,000 lives had been processed into the system, assigned a number, and then, according to the paper trail, they simply ceased to be subjects of medical interest. It wasn't a clerical error, it was a systemic omission. To understand how 10,000 people could be reduced to blank ink in the year 1915, one must look at the landscape of American medicine at the time. It was a period of radical, often ruthless transformation. The Victorian-era asylum was being replaced by the modern psychiatric hospital, and with this shift came a new, cold obsession with categorization and social hygiene. The Blackwood Heights Sanatorium was, on the surface, a crown jewel of this movement. Perched on a forested ridge overlooking the industrial valley, it was designed as a self-sustaining city of the mind. It had its own power plant, its own farm, and a staff of physicians recruited from the most prestigious universities in the country. The year 1915 was also a year of profound global anxiety. The war in Europe was consuming millions of lives, and the ripples of that violence were felt even in the quiet hallways of American institutions. There was a growing fear that mental degeneracy was a contagion that could weaken the national fabric. Records suggest that Blackwood Heights received a massive, private endowment in early 1915, specifically to address this social burden. The source of the funding was obscured through a series of trusts, but the results were immediate. A new wing, Pavilion 4, was constructed with unprecedented speed. It was into Pavilion 4 that the 10,000 were sent. Early signs that something was amiss in Pavilion 4 appeared in the personal diary of a junior nurse named Clara Vance. Her writings, preserved by her descendants and only recently brought to light, describe a wing of the hospital that operated under a different set of laws than the rest of the facility. Clara wrote in March of 1915, "The new admissions do not come through the main gates. They arrive at the rail, siding in the middle of the night. There are no family members to meet them. There are no suitcases. When I asked Dr. Aris about the lack of intake exams, he told me that their histories were predetermined and that my duty was to observe the silence, not the patient." But that wasn't the strangest part. As the months went on, Clara noted that the staff assigned to Pavilion 4 were forbidden from speaking to the patients. The ward was kept in a state of perpetual, artificial twilight, with heavy curtains drawn at all hours. The most unsettling detail, however, was the food. Clara observed that the caloric intake for the patients in Pavilion 4 was nearly triple that of the general population, yet they were never seen exercising or even walking the grounds. They were being maintained. But for what purpose? The records do not say. By the summer of 1915, the blank files were accumulating at a rate of nearly 40 per day. In the main administration building, the clerks were reportedly instructed to file these empty folders in a separate vault, one that required a dual-key system to access. What happened next remains unclear, but the atmosphere at Blackwood Heights began to shift from clinical efficiency to something approaching paranoia. In July, a local newspaper, the Valley Chronicle, published a small, cryptic advertisement. It was a notice of inquiry placed by a group of families from a neighboring state. They were searching for loved ones who had been transferred to a specialized facility in the valley for the treatment of nervous exhaustion. When a reporter from the Chronicle attempted to visit Blackwood Heights to follow up on the ad, he was turned away at the gate by armed guards, a radical departure from the hospital's public image of transparency and moral treatment. The reporter, a man named Elias Thorne, didn't give up. He began interviewing the delivery drivers who serviced the sanatorium. One driver, who spoke on the condition of anonymity, claimed that he was no longer delivering standard medical supplies to Pavilion 4. Instead, he was hauling crates of heavy industrial salt and massive quantities of high-grade paraffin wax. Paraffin and salt have no place in a standard 1915 psychiatric regimen, and that's when things began to shift. Internal memos recovered from the sanatorium's furnace room decades later suggest that a rift had formed among the medical staff. A faction of doctors, led by a Dr. Sterling, began to protest the blank file protocol. They argued that the patients in Pavilion 4 were being denied their fundamental right to a medical identity. Sterling's letters to the Board of Overseers are frantic, filled with references to the suspension of the human soul and the mechanical preservation of the flesh. One letter, dated the 14th of September 1915, contains a sentence that has haunted researchers for years. "We are no longer practicing medicine in Pavilion 4, we are practicing archaeology on the living." There is no record of a reply to Sterling's letters. In fact, within a week of sending that final missive, Dr. Sterling was dismissed from his post. His name was scrubbed from the hospital's payroll, and his own medical records were reportedly destroyed. The silence had become absolute. As autumn approached, the influx of patients to Pavilion 4 accelerated. The rail siding was active every night. The blank files now filled 3 entire rows of the secure vault. But as the numbers climbed toward the 10 to 1,000 mark, a new phenomenon was reported by the residents of the valley below. They described a low, continuous vibration coming from the ridge, a sound like the humming of a massive electrical transformer. In 1915, electricity was still a luxury, and the sanatorium's private power plant was not equipped to generate that kind of output. Some historians believe that Pavilion 4 wasn't a ward at all, but a laboratory for early, undisclosed experiments in deep brain stimulation or primitive forms of electro-sleep, funded by a government desperate to find a way to reset the minds of soldiers returning from the horrors of the Great War. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. In October of 1915, a massive fire broke out in the basement of Pavilion 4. The blaze was localized, contained entirely within the reinforced concrete walls of the new wing. The local fire department was not called. The hospital's own internal fire brigade handled the situation. When the smoke finally cleared, the Board of Overseers issued a brief statement. A thermal accident had occurred, and the patients of Pavilion 4 had been transferred to an undisclosed federal facility for their own safety. But there is no record of 10,000 patients being admitted to any other hospital in the United States. No train manifests exist for their departure. No death certificates were filed. They didn't just move. They vanished. And they left behind 10,000 blank files as the only evidence that they had ever existed. The thermal accident of October 1915 didn't just incinerate equipment, it seemed to cauterize the memory of the institution itself. In the weeks following the fire, the Board of Overseers initiated what administrative historians now call the Great Erasure. While the rest of the sanatorium continued to function, Pavilion 4 was not rebuilt. Instead, its charred windows were boarded with heavy oak planks, and its entrance was bricked over with a precision that suggested a permanent entombment rather than a temporary closure. By the spring of 1916, the staff who had worked in that wing had been scattered. Many were given generous pensions on the condition of their immediate relocation to the West Coast or overseas. Clara Vance, the nurse whose diary provided the first cracks in the facade, disappeared from the local census entirely. For nearly 20 years, the bricked-up shell of Pavilion 4 sat on the ridge like a silent sentinel. It wasn't until 1934, during a state-mandated audit of institutional assets during the Great Depression, that the doors were finally breached again. The audit team expected to find a ruined ward filled with rusted bed frames and ash. Instead, when they broke through the brickwork, they found a space that had been meticulously, almost obsessively, cleaned. There was no soot on the walls, there was no debris on the floors. But that wasn't the strangest part. When the surveyors compared the interior dimensions of the wing to the original 1915 blueprints, they realized the math didn't add up. The central corridor was exactly 12 feet shorter than it should have been. Behind a false wall of industrial plaster, they discovered a secondary, narrow staircase that led not down to a basement, but into a reinforced concrete vault situated directly beneath the sanatorium's power plant. Inside this vault, the air was unnaturally dry, preserved by a ventilation system that was still partially functional, powered by a hidden tap into the main facility's grid. The room was lined with hundreds of small, copper-lined lockers. Most were empty. But in locker 7402, the auditors found a single, leather-bound notebook. This notebook didn't belong to a doctor. It belonged to a patient. According to the handwritten entries, which began in August 1915, the patient, identified only as 7402, was a former telegraph operator who had been admitted for auditory overstimulation. Unlike the 10,000 blank files in the main archive, this notebook provided a visceral, if fragmented, account of life inside the silence. The entries describe a daily routine that had nothing to do with medicine. The patients were not being treated. They were being calibrated. 7402 wrote, "The salt is in the air now. It stings the throat, but Dr. Aris says it is necessary for the conductivity. We sit in the copper chairs for 6 hours a day. We do not speak. We listen to the wire. The wire hums with the voices of the war, but it isn't the soldiers we're hearing. It's the mathematics of the machine." And that's when things began to shift in the researchers' understanding of the blank files. Some historians believe that the 10,000 patients were not victims of a failed medical experiment, but components in a massive, human-centric biological computer. In 1915, the concept of computing was still tied to human labor. By using the heightened sensory states of the mentally fragile and placing them in an environment of extreme isolation and acoustic focus, the directors of Blackwood Heights may have been attempting to create a human processing array, a way to decode encrypted signals from the European front by using the subconscious pattern recognition of the human brain. The 10,000 blank files weren't an oversight. They were a security measure. If the patients were effectively hardware, they required no medical history. They only required a serial number and a functional nervous system. This theory would explain the massive caloric intake. The brain, under intense cognitive load, consumes enormous amounts of energy. It would explain the salt and the paraffin wax, which could be used as desiccants and insulators for the sensitive copper-lined environments required for such an experiment. However, there is no clear consensus on how such a primitive system could actually function. What is clear, however, is that the thermal accident of October coincided exactly with a major shift in the cryptographic landscape of the Great War. As the 1934 audit continued, the team discovered a series of glass carboys in the sub-basement filled with a thick, amber liquid. When analyzed, the liquid was found to be a mixture of paraffin and a highly refined organic oil. Floating within the oil were thousands of tiny, etched zinc plates. Each plate was no larger than a postage stamp and contained a microscopic series of holes and ridges. When modern researchers viewed these plates under high magnification scanning, they realized they weren't looking at language. They were looking at a physical representation of sound waves. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. The zinc plates were not records of the patient's voices. They were records of their physiological responses, specifically the rhythmic patterns of their heartbeats and neural impulses during the calibration sessions. The 10,000 blank files were, in a sense, the user manuals for these plates. Each file corresponded to a specific processor, a patient, and the lack of data in the file was likely because the data wasn't meant to be read by doctors. It was meant to be read by a machine that no longer exists. By late 1915, the experiment appears to have reached a tipping point. The low vibration reported by the valley residents may not have been electrical in nature, but the literal, synchronized resonance of 10,000 human bodies being pulsed with the same acoustic frequency. In a letter recovered from the National Archives in the late 1990s, a letter from an anonymous consultant to the War Department, the writer warns of the dangers of the collective harmonic. The letter suggests that the human processing array at Blackwood Heights had become unstable. It speaks of a feedback loop, where the patients were no longer just receiving signals, but were beginning to generate a signal of their own, a signal that was interfering with the very telegraph lines they were supposed to be decoding. What happened next remains unclear, but the timeline suggests a panicked, scorched earth response. The fire in Pavilion 4 broke out less than 48 hours after that letter was received. The transfer of the 10,000 patients wasn't an evacuation. Many historians now believe it was a liquidation. The absence of death certificates and train manifests suggests a grim possibility, that the thermal accident wasn't an accident at all, but a deliberate act to destroy the hardware once the system became uncontrollable. The paraffin and salt, so meticulously delivered in the months prior, would have acted as the perfect accelerant, ensuring that nothing, not the machinery, not the zinc plates, and certainly not the patients would remain to be examined. But the Great Erasure was not as perfect as the Board of Overseers had hoped. In the aftermath of the 1934 audit, the state quietly shuttered the entire Blackwood Heights facility. The ridge was declared a protected watershed, and the remaining buildings were demolished using controlled explosives in the 1950s. The site was reforested, and today, only the crumbling foundations of the power plant remain visible through the undergrowth. Yet, the blank files persisted, tucked away in the state repository, a 10,000-count ghost in the machine of the bureaucracy. Modern re-examination of these files in the 2010s utilized forensic light sources to look for indentation writing, the marks left on a page by a pen on the sheet above it. For years, the files yielded nothing. They were as blank on a microscopic level as they were to the naked eye. Then, in 2018, a researcher working on file 9998, the penultimate folder in the collection, discovered a single, faint impression on the inside of the back cover. It wasn't a word. It was a date. The 12th of December 1915. 2 months after the patients were supposedly transferred. 2 months after the fire that supposedly destroyed Pavilion 4. The discovery of a December date stamped into the fiber of a file belonging to a patient who had officially vanished 2 months prior shattered the existing narrative of a rapid, catastrophic liquidation. It suggested that for at least a small portion of the 10,000, the thermal accident in Pavilion 4 was not an ending, but a transition. Records suggest that the fire may have been a controlled demolition designed to mask the relocation of the most productive units of the human processing array. If some patients were still being recorded as late as the 12th of December 1915, it implies that the experiment had moved from the visible ridge of Blackwood Heights to an even deeper, more secure location. But that wasn't the strangest part. When researchers began a deep dive into the property records of the surrounding valley, they found that in the winter of 1915, a series of decommissioned limestone mines, located less than 3 miles from the sanatorium, had been quietly purchased by a holding company with direct ties to the hospital's Board of Overseers. The mines were never reopened for industrial use. Instead, municipal power records show a massive, unexplained spike in coal consumption at the local rail depot, coinciding with the delivery of heavy electrical cabling and specialized ventilation equipment to the mine's entrance. Some historians believe that the human computer was not destroyed, but relocated underground. In the controlled, silent environment of a limestone cavern, the resonance issues that had plagued Pavilion 4 could be mitigated. The 10,000 blank files were likely the final records from the surface phase, left behind as a decoy for any state inspectors, while the live data moved into the dark. This theory of a subterranean phase gained significant traction in the 1990s, when a group of local spelunkers discovered a reinforced iron door deep within the abandoned mine system. The door was welded shut from the inside, and the surrounding rock had been reinforced with the same industrial-grade plaster found in the sanatorium's hidden vault. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. When a remote camera was snaked through a ventilation shaft above the sealed chamber, it didn't find a hospital ward. It found a cemetery of machines. The chamber was filled with thousands of copper-lined listening pods, small, coffin-like structures designed to hold a single human being in total isolation. Most were empty, their hatches hanging open like discarded shells. But at the far end of the chamber, the camera captured a row of filing cabinets that looked identical to those found in the Blackwood Heights vault. There was no clear consensus on whether these underground cabinets also contained blank files, or if the data had finally been written down. The cave system was declared structurally unsound by the state within days of the discovery, and the entrance was permanently collapsed using explosives, citing public safety concerns. This brings us to the most human aspect of the mystery: the families left behind. For decades, historians assumed that the families of the 10,000 had been silenced by the chaos of the war or through financial settlements. But in recent years, a shadow genealogy has emerged. Through private genealogy forums and DNA testing, hundreds of people have begun to realize they share a common, missing ancestor, a great-grandparent who was admitted to Blackwood Heights in 1915 and never returned. Unlike other families of asylum patients from that era, who often spoke of the shame of a relative's mental illness, these descendants tell a different story. Their family legends don't describe illness, they describe selection. One descendant, a retired archivist named Sarah Sterling, no relation to the dissenting Dr. Sterling, shared a letter passed down from her great-grandmother. The letter, dated November 1915, was not from the hospital. It was from a federal clerk. It informed the family that their father had been seconded for national service of a sensitive nature and that his medical records were now a matter of state security. This suggests that the 10,000 were not just patients, but were being legally reclassified as intellectual conscripts. And that's when the narrative takes its final, most haunting turn. If these individuals were conscripted into a subterranean processing array, what happened when their biological hardware finally failed? 1915 was over a century ago. The patients are long dead, but the blank files remain as a testament to a system that valued the output of the human mind while systematically erasing the identity of the person who possessed it. In 2022, a team of environmental scientists conducted a soil gas analysis of the Blackwood Heights Ridge. They were looking for mercury or coal ash, the typical contaminants of an early 20th century institution. Instead, they found high concentrations of a synthetic paraffin derivative, a chemical compound that did not exist in nature and was not commercially available until the late 1940s. This finding suggests that the site was maintained or visited by individuals with access to advanced chemical stabilizers long after the sanatorium had been demolished. The ridge wasn't just a ruin, it was being monitored. Some researchers have posited that the Blackwood Heights experiment didn't die with the 1915 fire or even with the closing of the mines. They suggest that the human processing techniques developed there using acoustic resonance and deep brain calibration were the primitive ancestors of modern cryptographic and surveillance technologies. The blank files were the first step in a world where data is harvested, but the source of that data is kept in the shadows. Today, the 10,000 files sit in the dark of the state repository, their blank pages a mirror for whoever looks at them. They represent a fundamental fracture in the history of American medicine, a moment when 10,000 citizens were stripped of their clinical reality to serve a purpose that remains officially unacknowledged. As we stand on the ridge today, looking out over the industrial valley, it is easy to see the progress of the century. The power plants are cleaner, the hospitals are more transparent, and the archives are digital. But beneath the roots of the trees and the layers of limestone, the vibration persists. The story of the blank files is not a story of what was lost, but of what was taken. It is a reminder that in the eyes of the machine, a life can be reduced to a number, and a number can be reduced to nothing. The records suggest a tragedy, but the silence suggests a design. And until the state allows the final vaults in the limestone mines to be opened, the 10,000 will remain exactly as they were in 1915. Present in the fiber of the paper, but absent from the history of the world. What happened next remains unclear. Perhaps the files were never meant to be read by human eyes. Perhaps the blankness was the only way to protect a secret that was too heavy for a single life to carry. Or perhaps, as the low hum of the valley's modern power grid suggests, the experiment never truly ended. It just became too quiet for us to hear.